Good afternoon. How are we doing, everybody? Did any of you guys, who was at the party last night? How many of you weren't at the party? Oh, that's why you're all still fresh and looking alive. So we, last night we did a little intro to a little promo video we've been making, unbeknown to many of you. So before I actually kick off the session, just for this 1 minute, I'm just going to fire up this video and let you guys have a look at it, see what we've put together. I actually put this on Twitter today, and it's kind of nice, so I thought I'd share it with you first. Pretty cool, huh? If you saw yourself on there, you can take it back to your boss and say, "Oh, I was there, really." So that's on the web now, so there you go. We kind of like that. Kind of shows you a little bit of just how much goes into this place when you're not actually here, trying to build it all up, right? Ooh, what are we doing here? Stress testing. So we are obviously talking about stress testing SharePoint, not stress testing ourselves. SharePoint gets a bit stressing at times, doesn't it? So this does not include a masseur or anything to do with that. We are, however, going to be opening Visual Studio. How many developers in the room? Oh, I promise I'm not going to go into code, because when it comes to code, I have absolutely no idea. So I can copy and paste like the best of you. I mean, those of you that know how to dev. But we're going to be talking about using the tool purely on the back of taking the content that Ben Curry was talking about in the capacity planning session, all to do with scaling and trying to figure out how we're going to start thinking of our server farm build and our architecture, and how to actually take that forward and produce real-world analysis of what we can expect to find in production. So it's going to be pretty demo intensive. I've got a load of slides. I don't actually intend to show you most of them. But for those of you that get the deck, well, you're going to get it in the DVD anyway. There's a bunch of stats at the end that's just useful information. But if I'm not careful, I eat into too much of the demo time. And that's really what this session's about, is how to actually do it. But there's some obvious stuff that we need to talk about, which is why stress test in the first place. A lot of times people think that they're just stress testing to prove that they can handle, say, X amount of users in a business. But of course, the reality is that we're not really stress testing against that at all. We're stress testing against how many people at any one time are actually doing any one action, but also on the basis of what else is happening at the same time that that is happening. So it's no use saying, oh, I've tested for 120 concurrent users, and it's all fine. And then you go live, and it's not fine at all. Because you suddenly realize that search and BI and all these other application services that you've built in the meantime have suddenly changed your statistics dramatically. So why stress test? Well, there's a lot of things you've got to think about. Planning for growth, testing hardware. Maybe you're planning to say, well, what if? What if we change hardware? What if we add 2 more application servers and then move that Excel services into those 2 servers? What impact does that have in my page rendering and concurrency load rate that I can support on my web front ends? So it's a lot of what ifs. What if, what if, what if? The bottom statement's pretty obvious. Don't guess. Figure it out. Know it. So some common test criteria. Concurrent users, the obvious term. Web traffic, the browser client connecting to it, social networking. The actual Office applications doing work against the servers. Requests per second, one of the most common things that we measure against. How many requests can my server handle at any one time based on the user load currently on? Hardware failure against server performance. So what happens if we've got our 2 web front-end servers? So we've designed SharePoint so that we've got a nice load balance scenario. It's handling our concurrency quite well. Then one of those web front-end servers dies. Can that one server now take over not just the load of the users, but also the application services also running at the same time? If we can't handle that, other elements of this page will deteriorate. Our page load times may suffer. Our requests per second dramatically change in the amount of pages that we can chunter out or search results that we can handle at any one time to the users requesting it. So maybe what you're actually testing is if we have a failure, we are proving that one server is not good enough. We have 2 servers because we want resilience. But at the same time, if one was to fail and we had this load of users, it is not sufficient for our business requirement of requests per second, page load times, and surfacing that information back to the user. So in which case, you're now saying, okay, in order to satisfy both resilience, redundancy, and load performance, we need 3 servers at the front, not 2. Because you need to be able to have that second step in. Of course, there's other elements in that become very important, which is additional services. Anybody in this room ever tried to implement Forefront on top of SharePoint? Anybody? A few in the room. So those of you that have, you will have noticed that the load hit on your web front-end servers is immense, up to 30% hit in performance. Because if you aggressively start doing antivirus and content filtering on your web front-end servers that are hosting web front-end SharePoint and the content filtering virus element, the server load is now having to handle a lot more application services running on them in terms of CPU and memory performance. So what we find in those scenarios is that we then end up having to put a 3rd server in the load purely because of that application's hardware requirement. That's what we're load testing for. That's what we need to figure out. Things have dramatically changed from 2007, though, because 2007, a lot of people have 32-bit, obviously, so we've got rid of that ASP.NET queuing problem, where we used to have, even with 2 web front-end servers, we had limited memory space available. So every time, basically, as soon as we had X amount of concurrent connections, the 2 gig usable memory load just disappeared. And then we saw ASP queuing up all the requests from the users. With 64-bit, we've eliminated a lot of that. Mind you, all we've done is move it somewhere else. Because what people are now finding is that the web front-end servers, if you've got 2 or 3 of them working at optimal performance, they're now sending stuff to SQL a lot faster. And so SQL's now going, stop, you're too fast. How many of you were in Ben's session on capacity planning? So you'll have seen some numbers, right, when we were talking about there was a load of memory statistics and CPU requirements. And a lot of the SQL servers, remember, we're talking 16 to 32 gig of RAM on your SQL boxes. This is now commonplace in SharePoint farm environments. Commonplace. Anything less, and you're probably going to start struggling straight away. And that's without using a lot of the extra services. So in my demo, this is what I've got. I've got 2 web front-end servers. I've got an application server. I've got a SQL server. And I've also got a client that I'm going to test the stress testing on. And my client's got Visual Studio 2010 Ultimate and also Fiddler and the browser and everything else. So it's acting as the client. And the client is very important in this. Never underestimate the impact of poor quality client environments and the software that's installed on them for affecting SharePoint performance in the eyes of the user. The amount of users that can complain if there's some sort of dodgy antivirus program, no names mentioned, but we usually know who they are, that literally grind CPU to the death on a slow-performing machine, that can affect page rendering times dramatically. So before we can start using it, we need to think of the environment, prepare Visual Studio. I'm going to show you how to set this up in a minute in terms of the database. But one of the things we need to think about is not just setting up a machine to handle the Visual Studio configuration of the load test and the web test, but instead of having it going from one client, wouldn't it be nice to actually replicate the stress test coming from a dozen clients, 150 clients, hundreds of clients, and literally not just testing the impact of a particular function against the web front end, but actually replicating it from multiple user accounts coming from multiple hosts at the same time at the servers. And so for that, you can get hold of Virtual User Pack from MSDN. So if you've got an MSDN license, this basically unlocks your Visual Studio to unlimited user connections. And then you can install the agent packs on multiple clients and run the same test from multiple boxes. So if you want to simulate 2,000 concurrent users on a SharePoint farm, this is the way you want to do it. You don't just want to be doing it from one box. You want to be configuring a multitude of clients firing that test at the servers. So the MSDN thing, it was about a month ago, this was updated. So those of you that have got an MSDN subscription, there's a link. Where's my link? Is it on the next page? Oh, yeah, there you go. Is it on this one? Oh, I don't know. It's on there somewhere. But there's basically you go to MSDN and you put in. You need to get a new product key. So if you're an MSDN subscriber, just go to MSDN. You fill in a form. You get a new product key back. You put it into Visual Studio, and it unlocks your 250 agent cal. And you don't have to pay any more. It's all there included. So one of the things you'll notice is the version of Visual Studio that you need for this. You can't just run it on any old version. It must have a test edition built into it. So Ultimate, or the Visual Studio Test Edition. It depends which version you've got as well. Don't think you have to have 2010, although 2010 does include some of the newer components of the 2010 SharePoint connectivity elements like claims and stuff. You can actually integrate all that. But even for basic stress testing, we can actually stress test SharePoint 2010 with our old ACT stress tools from the old visualstudio.net, and also 2008 also has stress test editions. Although I'm going to show you 2010 for this. And if you just want to get to grips with it, and if you haven't got access to all the Visual Studio products, there is a trial edition that you can download and run full tests on it. You're just limited to 250 users. in terms of concurrency. But at least it gets you to have a play around with what I'm about to show you. You must create, I'll say you must, you should, as a best practice, create a repository database to use for storing the tests and the test results that we're gathering from our various web tests and load tests running. Because one of the things that we want to be able to do is take that data that we're storing it, and we can also analyze it as well for future reference, maybe trends over time. We're looking for statistical analysis over time. This database can be accessed by your own reporting services. If you want to, there's also on Codeplex, an actual script that you can download, some demo scripts on there. Ben Curry pointed me to this one. I didn't realize somebody actually put this one up there. There is a Codeplex project that you can just download, and it will actually have some built-in reports against your load test repository. Now, in order to create that repository, there is actually a SQL script that we can run. And if I just go into my SQL server here, so this SQL script, this load test results repository, is stored in the program files locator IDE of your Visual Studio installation. So this isn't a SQL script, it actually comes in the Visual Studio installation folder. And I'll just click it open here just to show you. And so what it basically does is configure all the tables within the database that are used to store all the load test results. Once we execute that, I should be able to go into my SQL Manager, and you will notice in here that we get a database called Load Test 2010 by default. And so this is the database that we want to use to send those result sets from our load test to. And this is going to be something that we can therefore analyze over time. So that's a nice little thing to run. Saves you manually creating all that stuff. And we're going to point to that in a minute. Obviously, when you guys are the developers in the room will know this. When you're working on different projects in Visual Studio, depending on what type of customer or build that you're working on, you can create different projects and have different types of templates for each project on the type of code you're working with. IT pros in the room, if you've never worked with Visual Studio, I'm talking Chinese. So what I mean is, when we start up Visual Studio, we can create a brand new project, for example, for a particular client that we're working with for stress testing or a particular environment, and within that project we can house all of our web tests and all of our load tests that we want to use for that particular environment, so that we can always go back into that project and relaunch the tests and add additional web tests later. So if you were somebody who was a consultant, you could have basically a project for each client that you're working with, and everything has its own details stored within it. Now those projects by default are stored on the local machine when you install set up your Visual Studio. However, you may want to store them on a network share so that other people could access it using their Visual Studio and get access to the same projects. You can do that. You can actually map it to a network share as well. So it doesn't have to be local. So there's the location, by the way. So I've lobbed that in there. So when you get to see all this stuff later and you can't figure it out, it's in the Visual Studio common/IDE folder structure. That's where you get that SQL file. And once we've installed that, we will open up our Visual Studio. I've actually got a project here, but if I was going to create a new project, I'll just create a new project there. And so this is what I'm talking about here in terms of the default location that's being stored. So program files, yada, 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 right? That's not necessarily going to benefit you. You might want it to be in a //server3/repository/whatever. Then everybody can access it. A bit more useful than just the C drive of your local machine. You'll also notice, however, when we start looking at the potential projects that we can look up, and you see SharePoint, you think, oh, SharePoint, that must mean that's where we can select our web tests from. No, this is all for developing stuff. In fact, there is actually no SharePoint template in here for us to use for stress testing. So we just picked the default test one, actually, which is at the bottom here, because that's just a test project. It means nothing. We need to have a blank slate when we stress test. So I'm just going to open up this one because I've already created one, save a bit of time. So here's a new project. I'm just going to close this one down. And so once we've got our project up, we still need to tell Visual Studio now where the database repository is that we want to store our data in from gathering from those web tests and those load tests. And on the top here, you'll notice we've got in our folder structure, and let me just go to the right place. Under test, you'll notice that we've got managed test controllers. And in our test controllers, this is where we can specify which agents we want to use if we're using multiple machines to act as the, if I want to have, say, 20 clients pushing data at the server rather than one. And then I can also specify here where the database is that I want to use for that repository. And so I can literally say I'm going to connect to a server, and I'm going to go to SQL Core in my case. Let me use Windows Auth. I can now connect down to it, find my load test, there it is. OK, that. And so now, everything we create in this environment, in this project, for these stress tests is going to be stored in that database. And then I can use that Codeplex project to then pull the data out after we've started generating information. So what are we going to do with this stuff? I mean, what does it actually give us? Well, one of the first things we're going to want to do is create something called a web test. And the web test is basically me saying, I'm a user, and I'm going to do the following action against SharePoint. And I want to measure not just what happens to SharePoint when you do that as an individual, but what happens to SharePoint when 400 people do that same action at the same time. And then what happens if I do that same action, but then I want to have something secondary happen? So a web test is basically an individual action by a user allowing us to record what happens at that point in time in SharePoint. One of the things that a lot of people make a mistake on here, though, when it comes to web tests, is that they try to do everything under one web test. So they'll go to the home page, and then they'll go to a site, and then they'll download a document, and then they'll go to a My Site, and then they'll stop the test. No, that's not going to help you. What we want to do is we want to create lots of little web tests that do a specific job that we can then have a bucket of tests, so that we can then create a load test later and say, I want to use the following web tests, accumulate them, put them together, and call it the test at 9 o'clock in the morning when everybody goes to their My Site. Because by doing that, it enables us to accomplish the what-if scenario. What if I want to test what happens when I launch My Sites to another 1,000 people? What will be the impact of the load test I did previously of the same actions, but in a different condition? So we need to create lots of little web tests. Hitting the home page, doing a search query, creating a document library, running a workflow, doing some sort of custom function. An interesting one that I put up there, what about 404s? See, we always assume that users are finding everything, right? Okay, maybe we don't, but we think that users are naturally going to where they should be going. But how many times have we actually tested for them actually not finding anything and getting redirected to page 404s or something like that? Surely that should be part of a load test scenario. Real world, right? And in case you didn't know, and I will show you this in a little bit as well, you can use Fiddler to record load tests for SharePoint. Has anybody ever noticed this? How many people use Fiddler in the audience? Keep your hand up if you knew you could export it to Visual Studio. Right, so you can. Very cool. Go into the client, use Fiddler, do something in SharePoint, go back into Fiddler. I'll show you where we've got this nice little export to Visual Studio stress test. So it'll actually create a web test for what you've just captured in Fiddler. Nice. Now, that's not to say Fiddler is the tool of choice, because there's probably things you could do in Visual Studio. And sometimes Fiddler doesn't capture everything, especially when you've got complex scripts running in the SharePoint page. You know, maybe some custom form action. Fiddler might not capture everything. So you have to be a little bit careful. Just double check when you are capturing it. And when you're creating these web parts, these web tests, what we're trying to do here is think about the impact of actions that could happen. So one of the key words here is baseline, right? Because if you don't know what it was doing when it was performing nicely from day one, how are you ever going to know it's performing badly in 6 months' time when somebody drops a web part on and everybody says, it's that web part? I mean, you developers know this, right? You do some custom solution, and then something happens, and you get the blame instantly, right? Nobody's actually checked anything. It's instantly the fact that you've just deployed a web part that's ground everything to a halt. That might have been a problem waiting to happen for 2 or 3 months. It's just been slowly progressive, and then it just suddenly keels over. It was just you know, chance that it happened to be roughly the same time. So if we don't have a good baseline from day one, how do we know the impact of each different change process and what our load test conditions were met at that time? Should not. It's a bit of an obvious one at the end there, but it's kind of, you know, think about it. You shouldn't be testing how many concurrent users I can support using Visual Studio on my production environment at any one time in the morning, right? This should all be done in a test environment. That's what this is for. So let's show you how that works. So I'm going to create a new test. Now, there's loads of different tests that we can actually create through Visual Studio, different types of environments. If we want to develop our own custom code and slot it in, and there's various examples on Microsoft's various blogs on load testing. There's a few blogs out there. And what you can do is, for example, create some custom code that could generate document libraries and populate 1 million documents in that document library as part of the script. So you don't actually have to just record the web test. You could actually tell the test to include the following code to build the solution. There is also another way of creating these tests, and that's if you've got the Administrator's Toolkit for 2010. How many of you have downloaded that? That's got the profile replicator engine, and yeah? Did you notice that it's also got a load test option in there? So in the Administrator's Toolkit, you can run this script that will basically create a bunch of web tests on the back of mining the IIS logs on the local servers, on the web front ends. So it will generate web tests for you. The problem is that doesn't really give you true web test and load test scenarios. It's kind of just mining local data, which when you do web testing, you're not actually just monitoring what happened in that time frame. As I've already said, we want to capture small web tests. That's not going to do that for you. So as nice as it is to get a bit of exposure to what they're doing, it's not really my preferred tool, to be honest. I prefer to create the tests individually. So I'm going to create a new web test. So you can see here we've got a project, add a web performance test. And that's going to launch the browser, which kind of confuses people, but it's basically saying, OK, what do you want to test? Well, let's just say I wanted to go and test, I don't know, my intranet. So let's go to, which one should we go to? Let's go to corporate homepage. I don't know, so let's just say we're going to a homepage of our site, of our intranet, and we go to that location, and we go, OK, we're on the intranet homepage. Now, at this point, I can stop the test. And what it now does is it goes, OK, you specified the following pages, and each of those pages, I'm now going to drill into where I've just been and make sure, checking dynamic parameters, that there's no additional code underneath that I would need to capture. Maybe there's a submit button on there or something. I just need to make sure that I've captured that in part of the web test. So I'm not just creating a static page, I'm also capturing things like how I authenticated to it. Because when you think about it, that's another important point. What if I'm going to do a web test? Now that's obviously just done it as me. Well, I want the web test to be able to be part of a bigger test with lots of other pieces in it. And I don't just want it to be as me, I want it to be as 150,000 users. So each test being initiated by a different user account as well. So one of the nice things we can see here, apart from being able to drill in and see the various parameters on each page that it launched, which is kind of cool in its own right when you're troubleshooting, because you get to see exactly where it was going under the hood. But if I was to turn into a specific web test, you'll notice that in the top of the ribbon, we have two options for our credentials management. I can either set the credentials of this one test. So what that allows me to do is to say, well, whenever you run this test, run it as the following user account. Well, that's nice. You know, I could be logged in as one person and run the test as somebody else. But what if I wanted to test accessing my sites? That's not going to work. I want to reactivate, I want to actually test going against 1,500 different users opening their My Site as themselves. Now, for that, you're going to need a little bit of custom code because you're going to need to script loading each page as a different, impersonating a different user. But we can do that, but we could also specify where those users are coming from. And so for that reason, we could maybe bind it to a data source. And I'm going to show you doing this in a minute. So I'm going to do a search in a minute. I'm going to do a web test against a search. And then I'm going to actually specify a data source of all our search terms and point it at that so that the search terms can be bounced over and over again, but as a different keyword, and see the impact of that. But in terms of credentials, I could say, right, I'm going to go into my Active Directory. I'm going to do a CSVD export of all my user accounts out of AD. I can then create a nice CSV file that's got my usernames and passwords all nicely structured, point this at it, and now I've got all my AD accounts ready to go, if I was testing the real world. Alternatively, you may just choose to create your own fictitious user loads for the test environment. Again, we could point it at a data source or a CSV file for that exact reason. And then we can pull that data out and integrate it within the web test. So each web test could potentially have a different source of users. So let me show you how we do that one, actually. So I'm going to rename that because Web Test 3 is a really useful name. So let's just rename that one. So I'm going to call that Homepage, just to be kind of semi-useful. So let's do one for search. So let's go close that. Let's do another one. So let's go into Corp. This time I'm going to go into the search page. It does say Giggle Search if you've not seen that yet. I thought I might get in trouble if I actually called it the other name. And so what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to fire up the search page, but I'm actually going to do a proper search. I actually want the web test to capture me doing a query. Okay? And notice I've gone straight to the search homepage, and I'm going straight there, and I'm going to run a query, because that's what my users are going to do, right? They're going to have shortcuts to search so they can search directly. They're not going to go via that page, and that page to get there. I want to reenact what happens when they do the search page itself. So let's say they do a search for sales. Now, obviously, I've already indexed my content here, right? One of the things I'm going to show you when we do a load test is what would happen if we were doing a bunch of work in SharePoint and then somebody clever in IT decides they have to reset all the indexes and recrawl. One of the impacts that we're trying to measure in stress testing, again in that what-if scenario, is not just the impact on our users of doing their daily jobs and more users coming on board and more concurrency. What we're trying to discover is, you know, what happened in a scenario where the index got corrupt and somebody just initiated a recrawl of content in SharePoint. Now you notice here, I don't know if you guys can see that from back there, you see where it's got results ASPX question mark K equals sales, keyword equals sales. So what that's going to mean is that this web test is specifically going to capture that information in the query string, in the parameters of the web test. And what we're saying is that's not what we want in a bigger test. We actually want to take a data source and populate it with 1,000 keywords. So we're going to have to manipulate the results set of this when we get it, if it actually wakes up. That's actually taking a lot longer than it should. Okay, well if it's going to take that long, it doesn't really matter because I actually have one. Oh, there we go. Okay, so let's stop that. I just needed to move my mouse. That's the age-old go left and right, you know. If you go anti-clockwise, it turns it a lot quicker. You never noticed that? So again, it's detecting those parameters. Anything on the page that it needs to know about, it's digging under the hood, seeing if there's any other parameters underneath, forms and stuff that it's looking for. It's got a lot more information that it's captured now, right? If we look at our, just scrolling across here, if we look at our page results and go into our, which one am I looking for now? There's our query parameter. So there we can see underneath the results.aspx, we see the query string parameter, and we can see quite clearly that keyword equals sales there, right? Now, if I go across to the properties of that particular element over on the right-hand side in the property values, you see here where it's got the value equals sales. That's what we're going to change. We're going to say, okay, I actually want to go to a data source. In my case, it's a CSV file that I've created for this. If I go onto my browse, into my desktop, there's a CSV file here. And we just got a bunch of words, bunch of document words. I just want to include this in the query string. So I'm going to say, yeah, that's good. Do you want to import it? Now, what this basically means is that if you don't have a copy of that word list in your project, it's going to import the word list into your project. So it's now available for other projects to utilize as a data source, other web test, sorry. So we only have to import it once as a CSV source, then we can reuse it. If I go back to the sales there, you'll notice that the value, however, has not changed. So even though we were able to add it as a data source, it was actually just taking us through the standard data source process of adding a data source into the Visual Studio project. I still need to go back in now and reconfigure to use it. And so I'm going to go back down to the drop-down list. I'm going to now select my data source that's available, and I'm going to select my A as my start point. So this enables me to say, right, I'm going to run the first web test on A, so the very first word that you get. So if I was to run that now and rerun that test, now it's submitting the word. There you go. So we can see here that it launched the able keyword. If I now went into the same test, I can now define it how I want it to reinitiate that test from that data source. So if I was to run the same, this will be quite fun actually. If I was, because there's got a lot of terms in there. So if I was to say, you know, run at one per data source row, and I was to click OK, and run the test again, what we're going to see is that as it finishes the first test, it's going to loop back round to the start and do the same test exactly again, but for the next keyword in the CSV file. Maybe I should have just done it for 5. But so there we go. Now it's kicking off. So you see it continually looping. What it's now doing is taking each of those keywords and doing a search query against it. So if you were trying to really hammer your search query, if that's an environment that you really wanted to go at and see what if we did this, what if we had this enterprise search and we had expected all these people to start querying, which, let's face it, users are going to do, right? We want to make sure that we're really hitting the index, the query role, and finding out just how well our queries respond to not just the users doing a query, but when the users are doing a query, as well as the other users who are uploading documents, as well as other users who are going to a My Site, what if we put all that together? Can my servers handle it? Because we are proving the point here as, do I need to create 2 new servers specifically dedicated to the query role? Or can my 2 web front-end servers in the existing environment support it? Or can they support it if I just add another 12 gig of RAM to each front-end server, right? Sometimes it's not about necessarily new boxes, it might be about hardware as well. We are proving the point that we need it. And sometimes when you're trying to get funding and budgets for this investment, it's proof that gets you the funding, right? You can't just walk into the FD and say, I need, £10,000 for XYZ. It doesn't work like that, does it? If you've got a nice big graphical bar that goes green, 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 black, red, and it's got lots of X's on it, they're a lot more likely to listen to you when they see calamity ahead. So let's stop that bad boy. Now we can do the same test if we do Fiddler. If you were to launch your Fiddler tool and did a similar process, so let's go to our search page and search for sales on here. If we go back into Fiddler, we've actually captured that information that we needed to capture as part of that process. And you'll notice that within Fiddler, once you've got your session that you want, you can export it. And then you've got your Visual Studio web test there. So that's just captured exactly the same information in my web test. You'll find the same K equals sales in the keyword, and we can just export that test out and bring it into Visual Studio. So we don't have to do it in Visual Studio in terms of actually creating the specific test. Okay, so we've now created our web test. Remember, the more web tests you've got, the more options you've got when you create the load test. The load test is simply a grouping of web tests together to reenact a specific scenario that you're trying to analyze. So you could have a web test that's simply saying everybody goes to the home page. In fact, I talked about this in my user adoption talk the other day. For some companies, a successful adoption from day one is simply that people do actually want to go to the intranet homepage every day because there's actually something useful on it for them. And if you've made your intranet homepage this really cool environment, you want people to be there. But you've got no results to compare it against because historically nobody's ever gone there because it's been static, horrible, and useless. Now it's this cool thing that you've just spent a lot of time and effort doing. Hopefully people will use it. What is the impact of that happening every morning when they now log onto their machine and that's the first place they go? What if we've decided to make My Sites the default homepage for every user? So they all go to their own personal portal now. So what happens if we've not actually got every user with a My Site and we're going through this transition where we're saying, right, let's bring on the first 150 people onto their My Sites, and then on Monday we're going to do another 150, and then on the following week we're going to do another 150. What's the impact of that in each reciprocal week in terms of the server load of all those My Sites eventually becoming logged on at the same time? Because My Sites are a lot busier, aren't they, than the intranet? Because we'd like to think that the intranet's coming from caching, right? A lot more cache should be on the intranet on their homepage. And so the load test is all about those scenarios that we're trying to build. we're going to run the load test not just to gather statistics from the impact of those web tests. What I want the load test to also do, which it will provide me the ability to do, is to analyze counters on the servers that I want to monitor from performance counters. How many of you know how to use Performance Monitor? Okay, so most of you in the room have had a go at it. For those of you who did not put your hand up, Performance Monitor is one of the best things built into Windows that you can use for logging and keeping data statistics of the performance of your servers over a period of time or at a live point in time. Just to fire it up and see what's going on, it can give you a lot of information about processor, memory, CPU, applications. And we're going to utilize that in our load test for SharePoint because we want SharePoint to be able to go into the servers in question and say, right, on the query server, I want you to be grabbing the monitor counters for all of the query load, the query requests, the caching requests that's taking place at any one time. So if I was running my search web test, I would like to anticipate that a lot of results are coming from the cache of the query, rather than the new load which is being generated by a keyword that's not been used for a while and therefore is going to go back into the properties managed data database and the query index file to build the results. You'll also notice, however, that I've also included things like Performance Monitor stroke System Center. So if any of you are using System Center, of course, you've got a much more advanced management system for monitoring servers and counter sets across your whole server load using that tool. So if you are using something like System Center, I'd actually recommend you use that rather than the built-in load test ones, because that's going to be a lot more detailed. Also, don't forget, when you're looking at your load testing, you want to be looking at and analyzing data at various points in time of the day. Again, we go to this magic concurrency terminology. And people talk about concurrency in the sense that, well, what we're really doing is saying how many users have we got that access SharePoint. And that's not what we're looking for. Concurrency is all about how many users at that particular moment in time are requesting information from our SharePoint servers. Historically, concurrency in SharePoint runs at about 10 to 12% of your user force. So if you've got 1,000 users, we tend to find concurrencies around 100 users. In environments where they've not adopted SharePoint very well and done very poor user education or support mechanisms, it's in fact lower than that. You can get it down to 4 or 5% concurrency in a large company because people just aren't using it. In companies that are adopting to SharePoint 2010 and using all of the capabilities of it, like these My Sites and all the new social elements to it, we've actually seen concurrency go up as high as 25 to 30%. So this goes back to the what if scenario. It's not just what if we have these users doing this. It's what if we actually get users to adopt SharePoint and now start utilizing more of that we're trying to get them to. Can we handle it? And if not, what do we need to do it? So let's go through the settings. I've just put that PowerPoint slide there for reminding you when you come to look at it later. So let me just close that. Let me stay there. Let me close that. And I'll close that. So I'm going to go into project again, and this time I'm going to do add a load test. Yes, it's a wizard. I know we all love wizards. Let's give it a name. So I don't know. Let's just say we're doing our. Let's do a load test and just pretend for 1 minute that we actually just want to get people using the home page. So I'm going to do a very simple one at the minute. We'll do a search. Oh, we'll do a search. We'll use the two. We'll use the search and the other one. So we'll do search and home. I want to see the impact of all my users doing that. So the first thing we have to ask is what conditions do we want to meet in terms of who our users are? So we could do think times here, where we could turn around and say, well, the average time that somebody goes to the home page is about half a second. Actually, I don't have an option for half a second. So we could say a second. They go to the home page and then they go straight somewhere else. Or maybe we should be saying, well, I'd like to think that my users are on the home page for about 5 seconds. And then they go to the next step. So think times is about how long does my user sit there and think about clicking somewhere else. So I could say, okay, approximately 2 seconds. What sort of conditions of the amount of users do I want to simulate? 25, 200, 150? So this is instantly just going to start the test at that amount of users. It's just going to go 150 users, boom, into the page that you send the test to. If you were kind of looking a bit more realistic in the morning, that's not really what we want, is it? If we're thinking about people coming into the office and doing this and doing that, our load test on an average day would probably be things like some people would go to the home page, some people go to my site. So I might turn around and say, you know what? I'm going to have a total user count of, say, 200 users. Actually, no, I'm going to go up a bit more. Let's have some fun. 500 users. And I'm going to step up in 5 user counts every 5 seconds. So we're going to go up in 5s, okay? So what we're basically saying is 5 users at any one time are going to be logging on approximately to launch into their system. And this load test is going to be using those parameters up to 500 users in terms of running the test and then analyzing the effect on the servers at the time that it's running. So it's going to take a while to get to maximum peak. We can then turn around and say, how do I want my tests to be distributed? So if I'm going to have, say, 10 web tests running in this, 10 different web tests, do I want to distribute it evenly by the amount of web tests that I'm running? Or do I want to distribute it by the amount of users? So I can say, right, I've got a total of 500 users. I want it to be 200, 100, 100, 100. So I can decide how I want to distribute the load based on that amount of users. So I'm going to do it based on the number of tests. So what I want to do here is I want to say each test is going to run equally. But I could change that. Because if I click next on that, we get the slider bar option for the web test that we want to run. So if I was to do add and add my home page, oh, didn't add it, go back in there. And I was to add, say, web test 3, which was my search one. And I'll add web test 2 as well. What I can say now is like, oh, okay, so home page, let's say 70% of people are running that. And then I'm going to lock that in. Web test 2 now has the choice of 30 or nothing, right? So I'm going to say, okay, 25% of my users will do test number 3, and web test 2, only 5% of that user load will ever use that one. So what this is saying to me is that when the load test, this particular load test is actually running, 70% of the concurrent connections are going to the home page. Only 25% are running that query. So we're simulating the real-world environment of what I expect my users to be doing at that point in time. Now, I'm obviously taking the knowledge here that SharePoint's caching a lot of stuff, right? So hopefully that 70% on the web front end shouldn't cause me too much grief, because hopefully a lot of it's coming from cache. But we can also simulate what environment those users are coming in from in terms of their location. By default, for internal, you should obviously always use the LAN. But they do have the ability to say, you know, let's do simulated load against specific type of connections. To be honest, though, if you're going to do connectivity links, you really should use proper connectivity software or hardware to simulate, you know, WAN links in between the clients and the load test to really get a proper result set for that. But it does have network type simulation. But for internal, you should always use LAN. Ah, this is nice. Obviously, this is not a SharePoint-specific tool, so IE 5.5 is quite OK. But we could obviously include the various versions of browsers. What if we wanted to test the same impact against Firefox or whatever? Visual Studio just needs to be told about the different clients, and it can actually load more into this. Let's use IE8. Mind you, we could add more. I mean, if I wanted to add into Firefox into that and say, you know, I've got a, OK, so there's my users. There's my devs. You know who you are. And then it says, so, OK, so we've now got, you've told me that you want to run this load test. You've told me which of those web tests you want to include in this load test. You've told me what distribution you want me to run against it. What do you want me to monitor on the servers that I am actually hitting? What would you like me to gather in terms of data? So I can start adding my various PCs that are in my servers in the farm. So SharePoint 1. Now, I've actually got 3 servers, right? My SharePoint 1 is my app server, and my SharePoint 2 is a web front end, and my SharePoint 3 is another web front end. And no, I'm not going to add the DC at this point. You'll notice that there's various counter sets that are there out the box, right? So we've got an application server, we've got SQL, we've got IIS. These are standard counters that have been provided by the product teams of each component of standard things you'd want to monitor for that product. So for IIS, you're obviously going to get lots of web page, ASP.NET stuff. In SQL, you're going to get database queries and stuff like that, locks and things. Against application, you're going to get things like memory and CPU. There's an obvious one missing here, though, isn't there? No SharePoint, right? Out the box, we just get these 5 default ones. But we can create our own custom sets here. So after we've done this, I'll show you how we create a custom set of these. And then we can add whatever we want. So obviously, I'm going to do application for all of them. And there's my SQL one for the SQL server. On my SharePoint 1, I'm going to do application. I'll do IIS. I'll do my .NET, ASP.NET. And I don't need SQL on there. SharePoint 2, I'll do the same thing. IIS, and again, SharePoint 3, the same thing. Because what we're trying to figure out here, don't forget, is not just what's the impact of my web front-end servers. So if I'm activating, say, a web test and a bunch of web tests against the web front-end, but that web test is doing Excel services, and that's going to hit the Excel services on the application server, what I want to be gathering is what's the impact on the web front end against what's the impact on the application server if I start getting more people using Excel services. What you may find is the front end server handles it quite well, but your Excel server suddenly starts getting hammered. And so that's where you've got to concentrate your resources. Now we get the load test duration. So I don't know, 10 minutes we're going to... But obviously, if you think about it, if you're trying to simulate a load test over a longer period of time, 10 minutes is not going to be enough. You can test it for days, over a weekend. What's the impact of running all these scripts? You might have scripts that are firing off in your web test at periodic times, doing specific things, like a bunch of team sites being created. So this is not just a short-term tool. 10 minutes is good for us. If I'm looking at the time, probably not. Now, there's my test. So you notice here that we've got our counter sets here. If I scroll up, you can see my counter sets listed. If I right-click that, I can do Add Custom Counter Set. I can rename this. So this could be my SharePoint query, for example. OK, that. I can now add counters to that. So what I'm now going to be able to do is go into the various servers, which I can't because I'm not an administrator on that box, I've just realized. So if I wanted to do that, I just realised I logged onto that as Steve. Let me just add him in here quickly. Because obviously a user has no right to be a local admin, right? Because I'm accessing Performance Monitor, aren't I? So in order to do that, I need to be logged on as a user that's actually got the ability to do that, which is a local server, right? Or server admin, right? And so what this is going to do is connect to that server, allow me to drill down into those performance counters on that server. And don't forget, you only see the counters of the products that are installed on that server. So because SharePoint's installed on SharePoint 2, I shall see all the SharePoint counters that have now been available on SharePoint 2. Now, obviously, there's an awful lot of stuff here, right? We could easily get lost in this. So there, for example, there's the search there. And here we can see various groupings of things like get row creating, queue latency for queries, documents in propagation, index sizes, all sorts of things we can get for index and query here. Usually queuing's a good one. We can see the merging of indexes if we're doing lots of indexing processes. And we can see there's some queries there. So we can see queries succeeded, queries failed, queries total. So we can just add these custom counters in now. I can then go back to my original counter set that each server had allocated to it, for example, SharePoint 2, and I can now tick that SharePoint query set here. So bing, bing, bing. I don't need it on, oh, no, which one did I just put it on? SharePoint 3 needs it. And SharePoint, that doesn't need it. SharePoint 2 and 3 are my front-end servers, right? They're the ones that are going to answer the queries. So if I was to OK that, I've now added that second counter set. We can obviously edit any of these parameters in the properties value. If I now run that test from here, I'm obviously running this so that you will see the results. You might choose to schedule this or run it over a particular period of time when you want to gather the data. The first thing you'll notice in Visual Studio is it gives you these horrible key indicators from the machine you're running this from. So this is for me to monitor live data. And so I'm actually going to untick all of that. I'm going to bring this across here so we can get a bigger screen. And I'm going to go into one panel just to, again, show you guys what we can see in a bit more detail. And I'm actually going to remove these useless ones here. And what you're going to notice on the left-hand side is that we can see the computers that we might want to be monitoring for this. So I could turn around and scroll down on SharePoint 2, for example, and see the memory and do pages per second and show on the graph. Where has my other clients gone? Did I not add them in? That's interesting. It is. Yes. Yeah. So because I'm running this as Steve and he's not a local admin on the other ones, I'm not going to be able to get squat from the other ones. But that's fine, because that's not really what this is about. What I wanted to show you here is that this is literally now taking all of that load test that we were running, gathering that data, and capturing it all and putting it into that repository database. I'm never going to recreate the real world here, right? That's impossible. The whole point of this, this demonstration is to get you guys being able to get to this point. Create your web test, create your load test, and start monitoring this stuff. What we're using this for is really just to see what I'm gathering at this point in time. What you really want from your load test is the pages at the end, which is going to show you things like page request times. What's the average page request that we're processing? What happens if? So what you could do is, whilst you're running that, what if I was to turn around and go into my SharePoint 1 server and, I don't know, re-index it? Just purge your index and recrawl it. What if I was to turn around and, actually here's another good one we could quickly do whilst that's running, SharePoint 3. Well, SharePoint 3 is of no use to me whatsoever right now because it's not running very well. So it's not even doing it, so let's just power you off. Yep, off you go. what's the impact on SharePoint 2? Right? Because SharePoint 3 and 2 were load balanced. So maybe I want to initiate what happens if I have a server issue. So we may be looking for spikes, right? Well, so far, that's not good. Suddenly, we see this server starting to hit some more higher peaks, right? So in this particular instance, just one action of a server going down, we suddenly start to see a change in some peaks. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, because we're obviously, if it's just peaks and troughs, it's not too bad. But if it's flatlining across the top, we know that the second server was needed to keep that performance. What you will see is that slowly but surely, when these things happen, that the trend over time, it will slowly get worse. Eventually, when the test's finished, you'll see that there's things like total requests per second, 76 average I'm getting requests per second. To be quite honest, on an average page like this, I'd be looking at getting 250, 300, because it's an intranet homepage in real life, right? But eventually, when it does run out of the 10 minutes, it will come up with a nice summary page that you can use to analyze the data that it's gathered. You can analyze that against all your different load tests to enable you to obviously look for trends over time and proof of purchase or hardware, etc. You see that? Oh, I shouldn't have clicked OK. Typical admin, right? Yeah, it's a screen, whatever. So that was the over 250 users. Remember, I had up to 500 users, step. Got to 250, it went, you haven't unlocked the counter set. That's why I need to go to MSDN and get that new license key that they released a month ago. So then we get the various results pages, and you can see here that we're getting a summary of the page performance time, some of the poorly performing pages. We can see maximum load was 255, so that's where we saw that 250 limit reached. We can see the various tests that were running, and we can see how many were cached, 62% from cache. Okay, not bad. But then we were hitting a few core pages that we knew would come from cache, right? So let's just summarize what we've just seen, because Spencer's just sat down, so I know he's ready. So aggregate them together, add your custom counters. What I've done, obviously for when you get the PowerPoint deck and your DVDs later, I've just added, one of the things that people always think about is, well, what counters should I therefore monitor for this? What are some of the core things that I should add into those custom sets, especially if you've never used Performance Monitor before. They all publish them on TechNet and MSDN as well, but I've just put a bunch of them on here just to get you started. So for things like processors, paging, memory, and then what you're looking for in each of those while you're monitoring them. So when you actually come to do this and test it afterwards, you've got all the pieces there that you need, okay? Just to help you get started and understand what it's about. But I think all these have been published now, Spence, right? Yeah, these are all on TechNet now. They've actually done a really good job in 2010 of getting all these counters out there in public. In 7, they just weren't out there en masse. Now they're all out there for you to go and analyze. So we've got the various flavors, SQL, SharePoint, etc. Now, I know we've run out of time because we've got like 5 minutes Spencer's on for this session, which is on what? Federation Service Apps. Okay, so I know I've not got too much time, but you feel free to come up and ask questions for a bit. If not, I'm always outside on the stand for a bit anyway. And we've got the Ask the Experts in here at 4 o'clock anyway, right? So I hope you found that useful, and thanks for coming, and I'll hand you over to Spence in a minute.